Britain's oldest sites are not the ones you already know. England alone has more than 3,000 deserted medieval villages, and almost nobody has heard of any of them. There's a Welsh tomb near Stonehenge built from the same stone, whose roof slab has balanced on 3 uprights for 5,000 years. There's a church in County Durham built in the 670s, standing on stone stolen from an abandoned Roman fort. And there's a Yorkshire village where archaeologists found bodies that had been deliberately burned and taken apart, because whoever buried them feared they'd come back. 10 forgotten sites ranked from remarkable to almost impossible to believe, starting now. Number 10 is Kilpeck Church in the small Herefordshire village of the same name. It went up in the early 1100s. The nave, the chancel and the rounded apse at the back have barely changed since the stonemasons finished them. That alone makes Kilpeck one of the most complete small Romanesque churches still standing in England. The carving is what actually pulls in more than 1,000 visitors a year, despite the church sitting in the middle of nowhere. The south door is covered in warriors, birds, snakes and monsters. A group of masons historians now call the Herefordshire School carved every figure, and each one is still sharp enough to read after 900 years. Look up at the corbel table, the row of carved stone brackets running under the roofline. You'll find dozens more figures there, men, animals, and one thing Victorian restorers usually tore out the moment they found it. That one is a Sheila na gig, an explicit carved female figure and one of the best documented examples of this rare, still debated type of medieval carving. Restorers stripped out other corbels they judged too crude for a parish church. Somehow this one survived every round of cleanup. Even the font inside carries the same strangeness, held up by 2 enormous carved stone hands gripping the bowl. This is a single parish church in a village most maps barely label. It isn't a cathedral with a gift shop and a coach park. And it's still carrying carving this good on a budget, that small. 900 years of English weather have passed. Several waves of Victorian tidying have passed too. The strangest carvings on the building are still exactly where the original masons put them. And 900 years sounds like a lot, until you see where this list is actually headed. Number 9 goes back further than any building has a right to survive. This is Escomb Church in County Durham, built around the year 670. That's only a few decades after St. Augustine's mission reached England in 597 and started building the first organised churches on the island. It makes Escomb one of the very earliest. It's one of just 4 complete Anglo-Saxon churches left standing anywhere in England, alongside St. Lawrence's in Bradford-on-Avon, Greenstead Church and All Saints in Brixworth. Historians call it the most complete small Anglo-Saxon church still standing. Most of what those first English builders put up has vanished, but Escomb never did. Part of the reason is what it's built from. The Anglo-Saxon builders scavenged their stone from the nearby Roman fort of Venovia, abandoned by then for centuries. You can still find the proof on the north wall today. A reused Roman block stamped "Leg Sick" for the 6th Legion, set in upside down. It's a building from the dawn of English Christianity, held together with stolen Roman military stone. Escomb has stayed a working church for roughly 1,350 years. There's only one real gap, starting in 1863 when the parish built a newer Victorian church nearby, and let this one sit unused. Sturdy original stonework and a handful of careful restorations in the 1870s, the 1920s and the 1960s brought it back. It was Grade 1 listed in 1952. And Sunday services still happen inside walls that predate the word England having any settled meaning at all. Durham Cathedral sits only a few miles from here, and it pulls in visitors by the millions for its Norman towers and its shrine. Escomb is centuries older than that cathedral and still an active parish church. Most of the people driving past on their way to Durham have never once stopped to look at it. Number 8 is really 2 buildings that were always meant to be one plan. Castle Acre in Norfolk was started in the 1070s by William de Warenne, a close ally of William the Conqueror. He'd gained the land around 1070 through his marriage to Gundrada. The castle was likely livable by 1085, the same year Gundrada died there. Just a few years into building it, starting in 1081, William brought Cluniac monks over from Lewis to found what became Castle Acre Priory, formally established by 1089. The castle secured the land. The priory secured the family's standing with the church. Both projects were the same decade, the same man. One deliberate move to lock down conquered English ground from two directions at once. William's grandson later raised the earthworks higher and capped them with a stone wall. He began turning the original stone house into a proper tower. And he replanned the whole town around it too, wrapping it in earth banks and ditches deep enough that they still survive today, along with a stone gatehouse called Bailey Gate that a later owner added. The priory church was finished and consecrated by 1148, home to something like 20 or 30 monks at its peak. Right alongside it, the prior's own lodging survives in similarly good shape. Henry VIII dissolved the priory in 1537, the standard fate for English monasteries that century, and the monks took their pensions and left. What didn't leave was the building. The priory's great west front still stands almost complete, an oddly intact face on a monastery that's been empty for nearly 500 years. Ownership of both ruins eventually passed down to Sir Edward Coke. Today they still belong to his descendant, the Earl of Leicester, while English Heritage manages the site so anyone can walk in. One Norman family built a castle to hold the land and a monastery to hold their standing with God. Nearly 1,000 years later, both halves of that single plan are still standing in the same Norfolk field. Number 7 belonged to a man with no title at all, and he still managed to outsurvive most of the nobility. Number 7 belongs to a man who was never supposed to own a castle at all. Stokesay Castle in Shropshire went up between 1285 and 1294, and the person who built it, Lawrence of Ludlow, wasn't a nobleman. He traded wool for a living, and he'd made enough money at it to build himself a fortified house that looked like it belonged to an earl. Lawrence never got to enjoy much of it. He drowned in 1294 on wool trading business at sea, and his son William likely finished the last of the work. What they left behind is, according to historian Henry Summerson, one of the best preserved medieval fortified manor houses in England. Archaeologist Gil Chitty has called its survival as a near-complete, barely altered set of buildings, extremely unusual for a site this old. The Great Hall still has its original 13th century timber roof overhead, which matters more than it sounds like it should. Most English castle halls this age had their roofs replaced generations ago. Stokesay's stone towers, its solar block, and the moat around the whole property survived right alongside it. Here's the part that should have destroyed it. After the Civil War, Parliament tore down fortified houses across the country in a process historians call slighting, gutting anything that could be defended again. Stokesay got off almost free. They got off. Since Parliament pulled down only the curtain wall in 1647 and left the hall, the towers and the solar standing. Even the timber gatehouse, which looks every bit as old as the rest, was actually rebuilt around 1640, just before the war that should have finished the place off completely. Walk through the hall today and the layout still reads like a lived-in medieval house rather than a stripped-out shell. There's a real roof over your head, real floors under your feet. And the solar block where the family once slept, still attached and standing. Most of England's famous castles survive as stone skeletons with a ticket office bolted on. Stokesay survived as an actual building, and it took the accident of one lightly enforced order in 1647 to keep it that way. Number 6 trades one merchant's house for an entire Roman town, walls and all. Caerwent, called Venter Silurum by the Romans, sits in Monmouthshire, Wales. It was founded in the year 75 as a market town for the Silures, a British tribe the Romans had just finished conquering. It became the civic capital of their territory, laid out in the standard Roman grid, with baths, houses, a marketplace and a temple. What makes Caerwent worth the trip is what's still standing above ground. Sections of the town wall survive up to 5 meters high, about 16 feet. Historian John Newman has called them easily the most impressive town defence to survive from Roman Britain. He adds that their freedom from later rebuilding makes them some of the best-kept town defences anywhere in Northern Europe. That's one historian's assessment. But walk the top of that wall yourself, and it's hard to argue. Life inside those walls wasn't equally grand for everyone. An 1881 dig in a cottage garden turned up a detailed mosaic showing different types of fish, almost certainly from a wealthy household. Most Caerwent houses were plainer, without mosaic floors or heated rooms at all. So rich and modest lived side by side inside the same Roman grid. Foundations elsewhere in the town belonged to a 4th century temple with its own sacred enclosure. Proof that Caerwent had a religious life as developed as its market and its baths. Cadw, the body that manages the site today, lets visitors walk along the top of some sections of wall using stone steps. Lower paths give a different view of the same defences. That's an unusually hands-on way to experience Roman Britain. Most sites keep you well back from anything this old. The most striking thing about Caerwent is what happened after Rome left. A modern village grew up inside and around those same walls, and the parish church tower now rises directly out of Roman foundations. People still live their daily lives on a street plan the Romans laid out nearly 2,000 years ago. A little way west of here, past the Welsh hills, sit the exact quarries that gave Stonehenge its own stones. That's where this list heads next. Number 5 is Pentre Ifan, a Neolithic burial chamber in Pembrokeshire. KDW, the Welsh government's own heritage body, dates it to roughly 3000 BC or earlier, meaning its huge capstone has stayed exactly where it was placed for over 5,000 years. That capstone is about 5 metres long, close to 16.5 feet. It appears to rest almost weightlessly on just 3 upright stones, with no mortar and nothing else holding it up. What you're looking at today is only the stone skeleton of the original monument. The whole structure was once covered by an earthen mound, long since eroded away. So the tomb everyone photographs is really just its internal frame, standing exposed. Look past the stones and you can see the Preseli Hills rising behind the site. Those hills are the documented source of the bluestones, hauled some 150 miles to build Stonehenge. The same stone-rich hills gave Pentre Ifan its own material, and this tomb belongs to an earlier tradition of monumental building that came before anyone raised a single stone at Stonehenge itself. Stand under that capstone today, and you're standing inside what used to be a sealed chamber. It was buried under a mound of earth built for the dead and never meant for anyone to walk through the way visitors do now. 5,000 years of wind and rain off the Preseli Hills did what weather always does to an earthen mound eventually. It stripped the covering away completely and left only the frame, a frame the builders never intended anyone outside the tomb to see. There's no confirmed legend attached to this one, no giant's grave story or fairy tale that heritage records will back up. And that's worth sitting with for a second. Sometimes the plain, documented fact, a massive slab balanced on 3 stones for 5,000 years, using nothing but geometry, is stranger than any story anyone could invent about it. 5 entries in, and notice what's actually kept every one of these places alive. A merchant's house survived because Parliament only tore down one wall. A Roman town's defences survived because nobody needed the stone badly enough to haul it away. Even a massive capstone has stayed balanced for 5,000 years for no reason beyond good geometry and nobody choosing to knock it over. Mostly survival so far has come down to luck, poverty or physics. That changes from here. The next 5 entries aren't accidents. They're places where people made a decision. Sometimes a strange one, sometimes a frightening one. And that decision is the entire reason the place still exists in the state you'd find it in today. Number 4 is Wharram Percy in North Yorkshire. It's widely considered the most famous deserted medieval village in England, out of more than 3,000 that once existed across the country. Its origins trace back to a reorganisation of how the local land was used, somewhere around the years 850 to 950. The planned village that grew from it, roughly 40 peasant houses arranged in 3 rows, went up mostly between 1166 and the late 1200s. The Domesday Book of 1086 already records it under the name Warren, held by 2 Norse-named lords called Lagman and Carly. The end came in the early 1500s when landowners evicted the remaining families and tore down their houses to turn the land over to sheep. The village was fully deserted by around 1500, and the very last inhabited plot on the site held out until 1636. By 1931, the whole surrounding parish held only 40 residents, a near total collapse from the thriving medieval settlement that once stood here. Archaeologist Maurice Beresford began digging here in 1948, and excavations ran every single year through 1990. That's over 60 years of work that helped invent the modern method for reading an entire vanished community out of nothing but earthworks and dirt. Getting to Wharram Percy today means a walk of nearly 4 miles round trip, steep and often muddy. That's probably the single biggest reason a site English Heritage calls undoubtedly the most famous of England's deserted villages still doesn't draw the crowds you'd expect. It takes real effort to see the place that basically invented the science of finding lost English villages. Here's the honest part. Because this is exactly where a story like this usually turns into folklore, and this one doesn't need to. In digs carried out decades ago and properly analysed in 2017, researchers found 137 human bones from at least 10 people. The bones dated to between the 1100s and the 1400s, and they showed knife marks from deliberate decapitation and dismemberment, along with signs of burning after death. Researchers Simon Mays and Alistair Pike used strontium isotope analysis to check where these people had actually grown up. That ruled out the idea that they were outsiders or enemies. They concluded that this is the strongest archaeological evidence found anywhere in England of a community mutilating and burning its own dead on purpose, to stop them from walking again. What is documented, not legend, is that this predates Bram Stoker's Dracula by more than 500 years. It isn't a ghost story passed down by word of mouth. It's bone-level forensic evidence, dated and peer-reviewed, of ordinary English villagers who feared their own dead enough to burn them. Number 3 is Wroxeter, known to the Romans as Viraconium Cornaviorum in Shropshire. It began around the year 55 as a frontier fort holding a cohort of Thracian soldiers at a river crossing over the Severn. It grew soon after into a full legionary fortress for the 14th Legion, anchoring the eastern end of Watling Street, the Roman road that ran clear across the country from Kent. As the frontier moved on, the fortress gave way to a full civilian city. Between roughly the years 90 and 150, the settlement grew into the tribal capital of the Cornovi. After Emperor Hadrian visited Britain in 122, the city's centre got a major upgrade, a huge forum and a public baths complex spanning 2 entire city blocks. English Heritage calls Wroxeter probably the best preserved Roman city in Britain. Its baths are the only complete public baths complex left to see anywhere in the country. With a towering fragment of wall called the Old Work still standing over the site today, framed now by the museum that tells the rest of the city's story. At its height, Wroxeter covered 78 hectares, making it the 4th largest town in the whole of Roman Britain. Unlike Caerwent's stone walls, it relied on an earthwork ditch and bank instead. A defence suited to a city that started life as a frontier post. Now here's where Wroxeter breaks the usual pattern for Roman towns. After Roman administration formally pulled out of Britain, it didn't fade the way most Roman cities did. Records point to a genuine resurgence of activity after the year 400. New timber buildings went up well into the mid-500s, with possible occupation continuing to around 650. Some researchers have floated the idea that the city became the base of a British or even Irish warlord during this period. That theory deserves a clear flag as an interesting possibility, not a settled fact. What is settled is that people kept living and building in Wroxeter for centuries after the empire that founded it had officially given up on Britain. Workmen rediscovered the buried baths in 1859, and archaeologists have been reading this unusually long story out of the ground ever since. In 2010, a television crew even built a full-scale replica Roman villa on the site for a Channel 4 series. Based directly on the archaeological evidence, they opened it to the public the following year, giving visitors a physical sense of the domestic life that once filled this city, most of which is still sitting undug beneath the surrounding farmland. Number 2 is Jarlshof on a single headland at Sumburg, on the southern tip of Shetland. It holds the longest, most complete run of continuous occupation on this entire list, more than 5,000 years on the same patch of ground. The earliest structure here, an oval Neolithic house, has been dated to around 3600 BC through excavations carried out in 2004. By around 800 BC, a Bronze Age smithy on the site was working with tin imported all the way from Cornwall. That's hard physical proof that prehistoric trade networks reached this far north long before anyone would call Shetland remote. Iron Age islanders later built a broch here, a defensive stone tower with walls so thick that half the structure, now eroded into the sea, shows its own cross-section like a diagram cut open for a textbook. Alongside it sit wheelhouses that archaeologists call among the best preserved anywhere. They still show their original room layouts, connecting passages and corbelled stone roofs, exactly the kind of detail that usually collapses within a few centuries of being abandoned. Around the year 850, Norse settlers arrived and built rectangular longhouses directly on top of those older Iron Age remains. They were reusing ground that had already been lived on for more than 4,000 years by the time the first Viking laid a single stone. Occupation carried on into a laird's house built in the late 1500s and early 1600s. Then wind-blown sand buried the entire site again and left it hidden until storms stripped it back into view in the 1890s. Walk across that headland today and you cross every one of those layers in a few footsteps. You'll find a Neolithic farmhouse, a Bronze Age forge, an Iron Age broch and its wheelhouses, a Viking longhouse and a laird's stone house from the age of Shakespeare, all stacked on roughly 5 acres of ground. Stack all of that on top of itself and you get one headland, where you can trace 5,000 years of actual human habitation without ever changing your address. Number 1 is Skara Brae on the Bay of Skell in Orkney. This is the entry that makes the rest of the list look almost young. It was a working Neolithic stone village from roughly 1380 to 2500 BC, and it had already been abandoned for around 500 years before the first stones went up at Stonehenge. Run the arithmetic again. Skara Brae predates both Stonehenge and the Great Pyramids of Giza by close to 5,000 years from where you're sitting right now. The village stayed buried and forgotten until a storm in 1850 tore the covering sand dune away and exposed it to daylight for the first time in millennia. What the storm uncovered wasn't rubble. It was houses with stone beds, stone dressers and stone storage boxes, still sitting exactly where the people who lived there had left them. Every piece was carved from rock because Orkney never had enough timber to spare for furniture. The houses were sunk into mounds of household waste called middens and connected by covered stone passageways, which would have kept every household linked without anyone stepping out into the Orkney wind. Radiocarbon testing in the 1970s confirmed the Neolithic dates beyond argument. No weapons have ever turned up at Skara Brae. Researchers read that absence as real evidence of a peaceful farming community rather than a fortified one. UNESCO lists the site as part of the Heart of Neolithic Orkney World Heritage Site, one of 4 locations making up that designation. The settlement was likely abandoned over the course of a couple of decades, possibly driven out by a shift toward a colder, wetter climate. Picture one of those stone dressers again, the kind built directly opposite the front door in nearly every house here. It was clearly meant to display whatever a family owned that was worth showing off. Someone arranged objects on that shelf for the last time around 2500 BC, centuries before Stonehenge's main stones went up, and the shelf is still standing in the same spot. Sit with what that actually means. The oldest, most forgotten site on this entire list isn't forgotten because it's small or unimpressive. It's forgotten because it never got the marketing budget that Stonehenge and the pyramids did, even though it's older than both, and it still has the furniture to prove it. That's the real through line running under all 10 of these places. Forgotten never meant unimpressive. It just meant undermarketed. Orkney alone is still hiding sites nobody's put on a list like this yet. Tell me in the comments what it would actually feel like to stand inside a 5,000-year-old stone house. Consider subscribing, because that's exactly the kind of place we're covering next.